What if I told you that the political scientist who declared the end of history and predicted a permanent liberal world order just admitted he was wrong? That the entire global system built on his thesis, from the Iraq War to open borders to the European Union, is now collapsing in real time, and that Donald Trump understood what was actually happening before any expert in Washington when he came down that escalator in 2015 and said 4 words that changed the world forever. Stick around, because what happened next will blow your mind. What I am about to explain to you is something that no cable news network will ever cover. Not because it is controversial, but because it is the key that unlocks everything. Once you understand what I am about to lay out, every single political event of the last decade will suddenly make sense. Brexit, Trump, the rise of nationalism across Europe, the collapse of the left in Latin America, the fall of Afghanistan, the failure of the Iraq War, the implosion of the European Union, the death of woke ideology, all of it. Every piece of the puzzle clicks into place once you understand the massive civilizational shift that is happening right now beneath the surface of global politics. This is not a story about left versus right. It is not a story about Republicans versus Democrats. It is a story about the end of one world and the birth of another. And Donald Trump is not just a participant in that story. He is the man who saw it coming before anyone else and positioned himself at the exact center of the transformation. If you believe that the old political categories of liberal versus conservative no longer capture what is actually happening in the world, and that something much deeper and much more powerful is driving the political revolution we are living through right now, smash that like button right now. Every click helps us spread an understanding of this moment that the mainstream media is either too blind or too compromised to explain. Because by the end of this video, you will understand exactly what Francis Fukuyama's end of history thesis was and why it defined global politics for 30 years. How Samuel Huntington predicted everything that is happening right now back in the early 90s while everyone else was celebrating. Why the collapse of Kabul in 2021 was the moment that proved the entire post-Cold War order was a lie. What the shift from ideology to identity means, and why it explains every major political event of the last decade. And why Donald Trump is the most important political figure in the world right now, not because of policy, but because he understood the civilizational shift before anyone in Washington had a clue. Now let me take you back to the beginning, because you need to understand where we came from to understand where we are going. In 1991, on Christmas Day, the Soviet Union officially dissolved. The most powerful communist state in the history of the world collapsed. Not from an invasion, not from a war, from its own internal contradictions. The ideology that had held together an empire spanning 11 time zones simply stopped working, and the empire fell. A political scientist at Johns Hopkins University named Francis Fukuyama watched this happen and wrote an essay that would define the next 3 decades of global politics. He called it The End of History, and his thesis was breathtaking in its ambition. He argued that the 20th century had been a clash between 3 great modernist ideologies: Western liberalism, Soviet communism, and Nazi fascism. All 3 emerged from the 18th century Enlightenment. All 3 claimed to be the one true system that would organize all of human life. All 3 sought to impose a single, rational framework on the entire world. The Enlightenment had promised that scientific rationalism was the one true way of understanding reality. That if we could simply civilize the nations, strip away their religions, their traditions, their customs, their local identities, and replace them with rational, universal principles, we could achieve global harmony. One world, one system, one way of life for all of humanity. But there was a problem. The Enlightenment did not produce one system. It produced 3. 3 competing visions of what the rational universal order should look like. And those 3 visions spent the 20th century trying to destroy each other. Western liberalism and Soviet communism teamed up to defeat Nazi fascism in World War II. Then they turned on each other and spent 45 years in a global standoff that nearly destroyed the planet several times over. And then on Christmas Day 1991, communism fell. And Fukuyama looked at the wreckage and said, "That is it. The contest is over. We won. Western liberalism is the final form of human governance. There is no alternative. There will be no more great ideological struggles. History, in the sense of competing visions for the future of civilization, has ended. And the entire Western establishment believed him. Not just believed him, built a world around his thesis. The Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, NATO, the European Union, all of it was restructured and expanded based on the assumption that Fukuyama was right. That there was now one way to organize a society, one set of rules, one political and economic framework that every civilized nation would adopt. During the Cold War, these institutions governed roughly half the planet. After the Soviet Union fell, they expanded to encompass the whole planet. Every nation was expected to join. Every nation was expected to adopt liberal democratic governance, free market economics, and Western cultural norms. Those who did not comply would be brought into compliance through economic pressure, through diplomatic isolation, and if necessary, through military force. That is what Iraq was. That is what Afghanistan was. That is what Libya was. That is what the entire forever war project of the early 2000s was about. The neoconservatives looked at Fukuyama's thesis and said if liberal democracy is the inevitable endpoint of human political evolution, then why wait? Why not accelerate the process? Why not use American military power to impose the final form of governance on the nations that have not yet arrived at it on their own? Charles Krauthammer wrote a famous essay called Our Unipolar Moment. America was the sole superpower. No rival existed. No competing ideology remained. The entire world was ours to reshape. And so we tried. We invaded Iraq. We occupied Afghanistan. We bombed Libya. We tried to build democracies in places that had no tradition of democracy, no institutional framework for it, and no desire for it. We spent trillions of dollars. We lost thousands of lives. And we failed. Completely. Catastrophically. Undeniably. And then on August 15th, 2021, Kabul fell. The Taliban walked back into the Afghan capital without firing a shot. The American-trained Afghan army dissolved in a matter of days. 20 years of nation-building evaporated like a mirage. And a week later, Francis Fukuyama wrote an essay that said 3 words that changed the intellectual history of our time. I was wrong. The end of history was over. The thesis that had defined global politics for 30 years, that had justified wars and treaties and institutions and trillions of dollars in spending, was acknowledged by its own author to be a failure. Now, here is where the story gets truly fascinating. Because while Fukuyama was declaring the end of history in 1991, another scholar at Harvard named Samuel Huntington was saying the exact opposite. And everything he predicted has come true. Huntington wrote an essay called The Clash of Civilizations, and his argument was that Fukuyama was completely misreading the collapse of the Soviet Union. The fall of communism did not represent the triumph of Western liberalism. It represented the collapse of modernist ideology itself. Not just communist ideology, all modernist ideology, including Western liberalism. Huntington went back to the work of a French philosopher named François Lyotard, who had written a book in 1979 called The Postmodern Condition. And Lyotard's argument was simple and devastating. Nobody believes in the grand narratives anymore. Nobody believes that scientific rationalism is the one true way of understanding reality. Nobody believes that any single ideology can organize all of human life. The age of grand universal systems is over. And Huntington recognized that this was not just happening in philosophy departments. It was making its way into politics, into culture, into economics, into the real world decisions that real people make about how to organize their societies and their lives. What Huntington saw in the collapse of the Soviet Union was not the triumph of the West. It was the beginning of the end of the West's own ideological framework. Because if modernist ideology is dying, then Western liberalism is dying too. It is just further behind in the process. Communism fell first because it was the weakest and most internally contradictory of the 3 modernist systems. But Western liberalism would follow. Not immediately, not in the same dramatic fashion, but inevitably. Because the same forces that destroyed communism, the rejection of universal ideology, the return to local identity, the reassertion of culture and tradition and religion over abstract rational systems, those forces would eventually come for the West as well. And that is exactly what happened, slowly at first, and then all at once. Now let me explain what is replacing the ideological world, because this is the part that explains everything happening in politics right now. The world is shifting from ideology to identity, from abstract universal systems to concrete local belonging, from the question of what do you believe to the question of who are you? In the ideological world, the question that defined politics was, which side are you on? Liberal or conservative? Capitalist or communist? Left or right? The categories were abstract. They were based on ideas, on philosophical frameworks, on theoretical positions about the proper relationship between the individual and the state. In the identity world, the question that defines politics is completely different. It is not which side are you on. It is who are you? What is your culture? What is your tradition? What is your religion? What is your nation? What is your community? Where do you belong? And to whom do you owe loyalty? This shift is happening everywhere on Earth simultaneously, but it looks different depending on where you are. In the West, where we are still at the vanguard of the ideological world, where the Enlightenment framework is most deeply embedded, identities tend to be abstract and fragmented. Feminist identity, racial identity, gender identity, sexual identity. These are the identity categories that dominate Western progressive politics. They are still very abstract, very ideological, very disconnected from the concrete realities of place and tradition and faith. But when you move outside the Western progressive bubble, when you go to Europe's populist movements, when you go to Russia, when you go to India, when you go to China, when you go to Latin America, when you go even to the working class communities of the American heartland, the identities are not abstract. They are concrete. They are nation, culture, custom, tradition, religion, region, family, tribe. The things that people have organized their lives around for thousands of years before the Enlightenment came along and told them that all of that was primitive superstition that needed to be replaced by rational, universal principles. That is what Brexit was. The British people looked at the European Union, the most ambitious project of Enlightenment liberalism ever attempted, and said, no, we are British. We are not Europeans in the abstract ideological sense that Brussels wants us to be. We have our own nation, our own traditions, our own sovereignty, and we want them back. That is what the nationalist movements across Europe are. Hungary under Viktor Orbán, Italy under Giorgia Meloni, the rise of national conservative parties in France and Germany and Spain and the Netherlands. All of them are saying the same thing. We are not interchangeable units in a global liberal order. We are peoples with histories, with cultures, with identities that are older than the Enlightenment and will outlast it. And that is what Donald Trump understood before anyone else in American politics. Now, let me tell you why Trump is so important to this story. Because what he did in 2015 was not just a political campaign. It was a civilizational intervention. When Trump came down that escalator, every conservative commentator in America was evaluating him through the old ideological framework. Is he a true conservative? Does he believe in limited government? Does he support free trade? Does he check the right boxes on the Heritage Foundation scorecard? Ben Shapiro was one of the most prominent voices making this argument. Trump is not a true conservative. He does not have the right beliefs. He has not read the right books. He does not fit the ideological profile. And they were right. By the standards of the old ideological framework, Trump was not a conventional conservative. He was not arguing about marginal tax rates and entitlement reform. He was not quoting Friedrich Hayek or William F. Buckley. He was not speaking the language of the conservative intellectual movement that had defined the right for 40 years. But here is what the ideological conservatives completely missed. The world had changed. The framework they were operating in was dying. The categories they were using to evaluate candidates were obsolete. And the American people, particularly the working class voters who had been ignored by both parties for decades, were not looking for an ideologue. They were looking for a champion of their identity. And what did Trump talk about when he came down that escalator? America. Not an abstract idea of America, not a philosophical treatise on American exceptionalism. America as a place, as a people, as a culture, as a home. Make America great again, not make conservatism great again, not make the free market great again. America, our country, our borders, our people, our jobs, our communities. Secure our borders, not implement comprehensive immigration reform. Build a wall, something you can see, something you can touch, something concrete. Bring manufacturing back home. Not optimize global supply chains for efficiency. Bring the jobs back to our towns, to our communities, to our people. and we are going to say Merry Christmas again, not restore the Judeo-Christian philosophical underpinnings of Western civilization. Merry Christmas, two words that every American understands, that connect to family and tradition and faith and belonging. Everything Trump said was concrete, local, identity-based. He did not talk about border policy. He talked about building a wall. He did not talk about judicial philosophy. He talked about getting rid of Roe versus Wade. He did not talk about religious liberty in abstract constitutional terms. He said, we are going to say Merry Christmas again. He never operated in abstraction. He always operated in identity, in belonging, in the concrete lived experience of the American people. And the commentators who were still living in the ideological world could not understand why it was working. They kept saying he is not a real conservative. And 74 million Americans said, we do not care. Because we are not looking for a conservative. We are looking for someone who will fight for us, for our country, for our way of life, for the things that make us who we are. That is the shift from ideology to identity playing out in real time in American politics. And Trump saw it before anyone else. He understood intuitively what Huntington had described academically, that the world was moving away from abstract ideology and toward concrete identity. And he positioned himself at the exact center of that movement. And look at what has happened since. Brexit succeeded. Nationalist movements surged across Europe. Bukele transformed El Salvador. Milei transformed Argentina. Bolsonaro rose in Brazil. The entire continent of Latin America is flipping to the populist right, not because of ideology, because of identity. Because nations across the hemisphere are saying, we are not interchangeable units in a global system. We are nations, with cultures, with traditions, with identities that we want to protect and preserve. The pink tide of Marxism that swept Latin America was the last gasp of the ideological world trying to impose a universal system on peoples who did not want it. And when Trump shut down USAID and cut off the artificial funding that was propping up those leftist movements, they collapsed overnight. Because they were never organic. They were never rooted in the identity of the people they claimed to represent. They were manufactured, imported, imposed from the outside by an ideological establishment that believed it had the right to reshape the world in its own image. The world said no. Country after country said no. And the ideological establishment still does not understand why. This is why the legacy media cannot comprehend Trump. This is why the political commentators keep getting everything wrong. This is why the polls keep failing. This is why the experts keep being surprised. Because they are still operating in the old framework. They are still evaluating politics through the lens of left versus right, liberal versus conservative, ideology versus ideology. And the world has moved on. The world is not left versus right anymore. The world is global versus local, universal versus particular, ideology versus identity. The people who want to flatten the world into a single system versus the people who want to preserve the diversity of nations, cultures, traditions, and faiths that make human civilization rich and beautiful and worth fighting for. And on one side of that divide stands the entire globalist establishment. The United Nations, the European Union, the World Economic Forum, the legacy media, the tech oligarchs, the international NGOs, the entire apparatus of the post-Cold War liberal order that was built on Fukuyama's thesis and is now collapsing alongside it. And on the other side stands the people, the nations, the communities, the families, the individuals who looked at the globalist project and said, this is not us. This does not represent who we are. This does not honor what we value, and we reject it. Donald Trump did not create that rejection. He channeled it. He gave it a voice. He gave it a banner to rally behind. He gave it 4 words that captured everything the movement believed. Make America great again. Not make the world great. Not make the global order great. America, our home, our people, our identity. And the reason Trump keeps winning, the reason his endorsed candidates go 37-0, the reason the MAGA movement grows stronger with every election, the reason the political establishment cannot stop it no matter how hard they try, is because Trump is on the right side of the civilizational shift. He is swimming with the current of history, not against it. The globalists are trying to hold back a tide that is rising on every continent simultaneously, and you cannot hold back a tide. You can only be swept away by it. The end of history is over. The clash of civilizations has begun. And on every front, in every country, on every continent, the people who are rooted in identity, in nation, in culture, in tradition, in faith are winning. Because the future does not belong to abstract ideologies imposed from above. The future belongs to the peoples of the earth who know who they are and are willing to fight for it. That is what Trump understood in 2015. That is what 74 million Americans understood in 2024. That is what the voters of Latin America and Europe and the American heartland understand every time they go to the ballot box and choose sovereignty over globalism. The old world is dying. The new world is being born, and we are living through the most extraordinary political transformation in modern history. Not because of one man, but because of millions of people in dozens of countries on every continent who have all arrived at the same conclusion at the same moment. We know who we are, and we are taking our countries back. Don't stop here. The civilizational shift is accelerating, and new victories are being won every single week across the globe. Click on the next video and join us as we continue to cover the most significant political transformation in modern history and the movement that is reshaping the world one nation at a time.